Hello, welcome to the Performing Animal Rights podcast series. My name is Ben Hunt. I'm a performing artist and researcher at De Montfort University in the United Kingdom. Now, this episode is kind of a bonus episode. I had the opportunity to talk to my activist colleague and friend Leigh Venus on an online radio project hosted by the Newbridge Project, which is an artist-led community based in Newcastle upon Tyne, and we had 30 minutes to talk about my current project, Box of Shadows, which looks at bearing witness in the animal rights movement, and it's an online performance project. And we talk about trauma in animal rights and performance in animal rights and the two together. And Leigh Venus produced this piece, and it's a mashup between conversation but also parts of the performance piece of Box of Shadows, with audio from the piece but also poetry from the piece. So I hope you get something from this. I am on the other side here as the one being interviewed. And if you do find value in this, please share, subscribe, follow, review, whatever you can do to support this podcast for it to grow and to reach people who would also find value in this series. All that's left to say is on with the episode.
A truck turns off a main road, pulls up to the gates of a slaughterhouse and stops. Inside the truck are sheep, packed into 3 decks. The sheep poke their noses out through thin slats running the length of the truck, tasting the air. Activists in high-vis jackets approach and use cameras on extendable sticks to capture video of the animals. This video will later be shared on social media. The driver gets out, and 2 activists approach him to start a conversation. One of them is Ben Hunt, a performance artist and activist who has been deeply involved in animal advocacy work in the region across the last 4 years. I've worked with Ben throughout this time and stood alongside him outside the slaughterhouse gates, experiencing firsthand the trauma of direct contact with animals who are about to die. Over the last couple of years, Ben has been involved in practice-based research around how performance is present in animal rights activism, with a focus on trauma. I spoke to Ben about his work.
Witness. A box of shadows. Jolt and sway towards. Windows of eyes. Noses, mouths, ears. Vapor. Peering out to open. Green and sky. Familiar instincts bring them closer. Pressing against metal. The box opens, but no wide green. Just narrow metal to denser shadows.
That was the poem Witness by Ben. So Ben, thanks for that. Can you tell us about the poem?
Witness is a poem about a slaughterhouse vigil. So as an activist, bearing witness to animals entering the slaughterhouse and just imagining the two bodies, so the activist body and the animal body, and that relationship and the future of the animal going into that slaughterhouse. So it's quite a personal thing, and it always helps me put those experiences into poetry just to clarify and get those emotions out in a creative
So the
way.
experience that you're talking about is specifically the experience of bearing witness, which is bearing witness to animals arriving at a slaughterhouse, sometimes hearing the process, seeing the trucks leave afterwards with animal bodies inside, animals who you'd seen alive less than an hour earlier. How did the save experience inform your work? And can you just tell me a bit about your history with animal activism and the saves in particular?
Yeah, the save vigils are probably they were my first form of activism. It's had a profound effect on me as an activist. The profoundness is really in the experience of witnessing those animals firsthand. It's not just an abstract idea where we all know those numbers. We all can decide whether it's cruel to do what we do to these animals in the food system or the entertainment industry or whatever. But this intimate experience you have with the animals just before their death profoundly impacted me, yeah, and has as we're going to talk about, the Box of Shadows and my other work, and the poetry is very influenced by bearing witness, by being close to the
So
animal.
I know beyond the saves themselves and beyond the other types of what people would probably recognize as animal rights activism, you know, talking to people in the streets, turning up outside slaughterhouses, those kinds of things that the public are quite used to. Following that, you did become engaged with performative activism.
Yeah, so my background is theatre, is performance, in a sense of I trained in theatre directing and I trained in drama before I become an activist, before I became vegan. I was very much passionate about the live performative experience, and then that kind of, and I started working with theatres and with events, with performative things as a freelance theatre practitioner. And then that started to fall by the wayside when I became a bit disillusioned by theatre and by performance. I didn't really understand what I was doing with it. Am I just to entertain, or am I just to have a thought provoking, create a thought provoking play? But then where does that lead to, and what things do I want to provoke? I'm not really uber passionate about a lot of things. I'm interested in certain kinds of politics, and I'm interested in human rights, and I'm interested in all these things. But it wasn't something I lived by the bone by until veganism and animal rights came along. And then I got into that, and then I became really passionate about animal rights, and it just started to wear in my head. This love for performance started to creep back in, and I kept seeing performance done in animal rights, whether that's overtly or more subtle. And I thought, this is my bag. This is where I can thrive. This is where I find purpose. So I started to get really interested in that, not just from a practitioner point of view, but from a thinking about it point of view, thinking about performance as a tactic to furthering the animal rights cause. And that's where I'm at right now. So I approached De Montfort University with a proposal saying, look, I'm really interested in performance and animal rights. I don't think anyone's looked at that in specific detail before in the lens I'm looking at it. And they were like, yeah, you're right, it's niche. And I was like, that's great. And then I found a new footing as a performance artist through that interest and through that research and through that a meeting of two loves, really. I'm very fortunate in the fact that I have realized that, and doing something about that.
So it sounds like you've really struck lucky here because you found a way to condense all of this work and thinking that you've been doing around animal rights activism, performance in that space, and now you're doing the PhD.
Yeah, the PhD is really interesting, and it's got to be interesting for me. Otherwise, there's a bit of worry there, I suppose. And I always feel awkward explaining my PhD because I'm always very enthusiastic about it, but then looking at other people's faces when I'm talking about it, I always feel like I'm send them into a dizzying slumber, maybe. But I'll do it anyway, shamelessly.
Now's your chance. You've got an arts audience
Yeah.
listening. So here's
Yeah.
your big moment.
Yeah, it's a practice-based PhD. I'm creating performances while writing about my performances and other performances and comparing them, and I'm trying to highlight the importance of performance in animal rights and how it can be used more effectively. I'm specifically looking at trauma and how that manifests in performance. So, for example, the trauma of the non-human animal, or the trauma of the activist processing the experience, or the trauma of other people in the vicinity, from the slaughterhouse worker, the consumer. Yeah, and I'm working towards, so I'm doing 3 projects, and one of them is Box of Shadows, which I've just pretty much tied up. And I did a showing a couple of weeks ago. And that poem and the poetry you'll hear, Witness, Fairground, and Stan, are from that performance, as well as other things. What I'm really excited about is not just this getting a floppy hat at the end and saying I'm Dr. Ben Hunt and stuff like that. What I'm really excited about is taking this forward into the activist groups and really saying, look, I've got research here, and I've got experience in doing certain kinds of performance. I've got this feedback from this performance. We can use this kind of, if we think about activism like performance, and we can use performance to really our benefit, to really engage non-vegans in our cause in a really creative way. So that's my journey, and I hope to have something substantial by the end of it.
It's really exciting stuff, and I want to get into Box of Shadows in particular and talk to you about the recent performance. Before we do, you have another poem that you'd like to share with us called Stan.
Stan is a little bullfinch that I called Stan, who I found on the road. He must have been hit by a car or a van. He was heavily concussed, and then I took him home, and he was still alive, but he was just clearly brain damaged. And I made him comfortable in the hope that he would live the next day. But I woke up and went down to see he'd passed away. And it's really my experience of being so close to this beautiful creature, this individual, and bearing witness to the end of their life, and being honored to be part of that, and to respect their life, and the confusion from me whether what I'm doing is right. And I think that happens a lot in rescue. What are we doing that's when we're trying to help animals? Are we, especially wild animals, and they're injured, are we benefiting them by taking them in? Or, and if they pass away, was it the wrong thing to do? So he was beginning my journey from start my little micro sanctuary called Briar Sanctuary, which is just my house full of little animals, basically. And we take in wild injured animals, and we also have adopted quite a few animals in need. He kind of started everything off, Stan, and painted a picture of that experience of hope and grief, rescue and trauma to a certain extent as well. Stan. A red plastic bag lifts on the corner, on a tight asphalt bend, stuck on the floor, inches from rolling rubber. I roll past and reverse. That bag sways and breathes. On foot I see you, a bullfinch, unable to fly or walk. I wave by the cars, scoop you into my left hand while I drive with my right. Hay stuffed into a box laid into a tall cage, a glass ramekin of water, another for seed. You, Stan, into the box of hay. No rest. Sway and twist, lying contorted. I play a video of bullfinches singing. It soothes until the adverts. I help you into more natural positions, which you slip away from. Night comes, with hope that you'll heal. Hop and fly, home to family, to before. But your brain is stuck, struck with unstoppable metal. Swaying has stopped by morning, with your life. I take you to the woods, lay you in the long grass, whispering words of honor.
So we're looking at the Box of Shadows webpage now, and Box of Shadows is an online part scrapbook, part live stream performance installation, and it holds a variety of performative media that probes the idea of bearing witness as an animal rights activist. So the live element of the show isn't always present when interacting with the online space, but the scrapbook remains accessible, and there's this evocative audio playing in the background that was captured at a save event. There's eyes that you can click on throughout the web page. Some don't do anything, some lead to video, some to audio, some to the poetry that Ben's produced. It's a really interesting piece of work, and the live element is something that you haven't done too often, but you did do recently.
Yeah, the live element is a live stream. The camera pointed to me in the space of a animal agriculture trailer. If you look at an animal agricultural trailer, you'll see that it's basically a metal box with a slat in the middle for air to get in and for the animals to get some light. So I built the facade of a side of an agricultural trailer, and I'm on the other side. So you see bits of me, you see my eyes, my nose, whatever I choose to reveal. Yeah, it's me in that space. And the big thing is the human in the non-human space. And how does that make the audience feel? How does that make me feel? Because as activists, we talk about, well, if we were in their shoes, we wouldn't like it. Or there is examples in history when humans have been treated, and today as well, humans are treated like animals. And what does that mean? And we don't want to be treated like animals because they're treated horrendously, the majority of them. That was the main message, to explore what it means to be a human in a non-human space, as a metal box, a prison, a defined space, and that box is taking them to a defined end, to a defined place, contrasting to the audience who have space to move around, freedom to choose, freedom to go, well, I'm going to have a cup of tea now, or I'm going to watch this for a bit longer, or I'm going to go to the shop. All these different choices. So the main element is me, the human in the non-human space. And some movements I do to reveal through the slat are to entice some sort of animality, to show that we have similarities, especially thinking about the senses, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the breath, touch. So I emphasize my eyes, my breathing. I use sound as well. So I have a microphone with me and I emphasize breathing and groans and different elements, the scratching of hair, all these things you would hear on the spectrum of animals, human animals and non-human animals. So I'm trying to bring a similarity, a liminal space of animality. And that's time. And Box of Shadows, the scrapbook, and you can have a look at it. It's boxofshadows.online. You can have a look at it as the scrapbook, and you'll see kind of, as Leigh, you said, this kind of support, the kind of a context setting performative pieces for the main live stream. Yeah, originally it was meant to be a physical piece, very early doors before the pandemic hit. But I've since the pandemic hit, I've cultivated into an online space, which I think I'm happy with. It took a bit of learning, but it was really interesting that the most recent performance I've done a few times in front of academics, and the recent one in front of activists, and got some feedback on about how it can be effective and what it means to be what it means to be human in a non-human space. So there's a lot to write about as well, and a lot to reflect on in the next project I'm doing as well.
It seems like a core of your work here is bringing the humans closer to the non-humans and even the concept of non-humanity. And you mentioned there that you've performed this in front of an academic audience, in front of an activist audience. What are your hopes for Box of Shadows when performing in front of an audience who aren't engaged with animal rights issues at all, or perhaps aren't even engaged with or aware of performance art?
Good question. I don't know. What the biggest thing is, my concern is that how many of the audience members will be non-vegan, non-activist, non-academic, non-savvy on performance art audience, and who'd be willing to engage with it as well, which is interesting. It's interesting without being too down on it. It's whoever's my friend or family who feel obliged to come and see it. It would need a very clever marketing ploy to maybe entice public that I don't know. So I do see this very much as a way to process my thoughts around performance as well. So even if I didn't perform, I'd love to perform it publicly. But again, like I said, it's interesting to think of how it would reach the public, really. But even if it didn't, the whole process of it and the practice of it is enough for me going forward as part of my practice-based research, to take from that and to apply it to future projects which are very much more publicly minded and much more attuned to engage with the public.
Thinking about trauma, and you described your own experience at the first save that you went to and your experiences since. How much of your practice do you see as you processing your own trauma? Is there an element of that? Is that the bulk of it?
I think it's entirely that. At the beginning, I didn't think it was. At the beginning, I thought it was much more grand, more abstract in the sense of tactics and movement theory, which is a big part of my processing of activism for sure, and it goes forward into my work and my writing, and it's important. But my actual practice, my performative piece, it's creatively processing my experience as an activist, but also feeding from the community and how they respond, because I'm very aware that my responses to certain things are quite different. So like I said at the beginning, that I'm quite numb when the trailers go into the slaughterhouse. But then at the activist showing of Box of Shadows, and we had the focus group, and through previous conversations with activists, we all have different experiences from that. And that's interesting enough to apply to my performative practice. But it does stem from my journey as an activist, and I think it kind of has to, in a way, where I'm at the moment. It has to reach that. I mean, the next performance is a live stream of a performed hunt, and that comes from my experience of hunt monitoring and hunt saboteuring last year. And then the one after that is theatre education. A lot of my past experience and passion, another passion, is education. I used to be a secondary school teacher, and I'm really passionate about that. And I really see that as an opportunity. So it all comes from me, and it all comes from my own emotions, and I would say trauma. It's always interesting labeling things as trauma from my point of view, because I get asked about this all the time, about what is trauma and who feels trauma and what could it be. And it's a myriad of emotions for me. Again, like I said before, there's anger there, there's frustration, there's grief, and I feel like these are symptoms of a traumatic experience I'm having as an activist. The best way I could describe it is just sitting down, trying to enjoy something, and then you see an advert for something or whatever, you're just reminded of the immense suffering that you've been witness to, either through documentaries or through vigils or whatever. I've only started to realize that it's coming from me, and which is a massive relief for me. I feel like I'm opening myself up to much more creative possibilities now. Now I'm seeing myself as an activist performer instead of a performer thinking about activist or activism.
It's interesting how your thought process has been molded by the research and the practice that you're doing, and how your internal reflections on what you are. Are you an artist? Are you an activist? Are you some new combination of both? And I know you've got an interest specifically in the ideas of performance and trauma being somewhat inherent in activism. What do you think of that? Where in activism do we find performance by non-performers? Where do we find trauma within spaces where people may not be thinking they're experiencing trauma? Where are performance and trauma in animal rights activism?
Yeah, the way I see it is it's very much the performance isn't being addressed as clearly as I'd like it to be, or as I'm writing about. So, for example, the slaughterhouse vigil, you can look at that as a sort of performance, because we enter a space as activists. We are players entering a space, changing the stage. It's an empty space. There's a grass space. The one we go to, it's a grassy bit. And it just looks like a normal blank canvas. And we come in and we build a set. We have signs. We have a table. We create an atmosphere. We create a different mood. We create something. We create a moment, and it changes everything. It changes. The trucks coming in means something different that day. That truck is full of individuals. To anyone coming by, the activists are like a big lens to say, look. So we are players. We are pointing the lens. We're creating this kind of drama. And it's not, I think sometimes me saying that activism performance is to say, well, it's not real then. That's not what I mean. It's very real. It's a very real experience, but it can still be performative. We're being different people. I've never been that person before until I was outside the storehouse, where I'm the man who puts the sign up helps put sign up at the beginning. I'm the man who tries to talk we take it in turns to try and talk to the lorry driver, or stand in front of the lorry, or get footage of the animals going in. By me putting the performative lens on these things, we can go, look, there's trauma here. There's an opportunity to engage with the emotions that we feel, and I believe that if we did look at things like a performative lens, we could really go, well, what makes things engaging? What is our audience? What do we want our audience to feel and experience, and what do they want to go away with, instead of just saying, I just want to talk to them about veganism, or I just want to show my love for the animals. And on the trauma question, I think activism is a kind of a expression of trauma. So saying, I feel all this and I need to express that. And again, you need to perform that in a way of activism. I feel so bad that I need to tell other people how bad it is. I need to go to the street and talk to people about it. So I'm going to go out and perform because I feel that trauma, or I need to connect with the non-human animal at the slaughterhouse because I feel so bad. I am experiencing this. And that sounds selfish, but again, I don't think it's selfishness. I think it's a human or animal need to connect to something on a much more deeper level than just processing it in our own corner of our room somewhere.
And this is pretty hot stuff that you're dealing with in terms of the use of trauma itself within your work. So there's the identification of trauma that you spoke about there within the activist or within the experience of the animal. And then there's the performance, the deliberate performance work, and whether you should involve trauma within that. And I know one of the things that we've discussed in the past is the idea of, should you deliberately seek out to traumatize your audience? Is that something you should do? Is that something you should seek to do?
Yeah, it is interesting. There's a whole debate on consent and content warning and trigger warning, and absolutely there's room for that and the space for that. I suppose the interesting area is the feeling of trauma is the exposure to the animal's suffering, I suppose. And again, it depends on how we frame that, whether that's with graphic footage, which can be quite contentious sometimes, or whether that's through describing something in quite a horrific way. There's definitely this engagement where if the audience aren't agreeing to engage with this material, are we unwillingly exposing them to a trauma? And I suppose it comes down to measuring trauma and what's important and what's impactful impactful. I mean, as an animal activist, I would argue that the trauma that the non-human animal is suffering is constant and overwhelming, and the experience that I have in realizing that is upsetting, and I would say it's a form of trauma. But I am in no way comparing myself to the experience of the non-human animal. So there's some brutal confrontations there, I suppose, and I think performance and art and creativity has a vital role in exploring this way of how to engage people without turning them away. It's interesting to think about also disgust and objection, and how if we see something and we're disgusted by it, that can be a positive thing because it turns us towards something else. So if we see an animal being slaughtered, I mean, disgusted by that, it confronts us with the idea that we are disgusted by that. That friction and that processing happens. And a really big thing I'm interested in is trauma being a catalyst for change. So if we feel something, we've got to go through the layers, like Gandalf when he dies in Lord of the Rings. He falls through the fire and the water, and then he comes out the White Wizard. So he's grey, and then he goes through this whole experience of going down to come back up again as something more powerful. And don't want to big ourselves up, Leigh, but I feel like we are the White Wizards of not just Middle Earth, real Earth. So that's interesting. I think they call it catabasis or something similar, where it's a really big storyline thing where the hero drops to despair, comes back different and stronger. And I'm applying that also to us as vessels of change. So I'm non-vegan and I read about something awful and that takes me down to despair. And then I say, well, what can I do about it? I change to become a vegan, and then I'm still despair because no one's doing anything. So I go, well, I'll become an animal rights activist. And then the hope is the process happens to other people as well. You don't just hear that in veganism, you hear that in people who have suffered trauma, whether that's abuse or something similar. They've gone to a really dark place, and through their own will or through therapy, they've come out stronger and more themselves, more purposeful.
Thinking about that idea of activists being in a pseudo, if not entirely performative space when they do activism, do you think that there's something in this in terms of activists using art or performance to address their own trauma, to find whatever it is that speaks to them, whether it be the kind of performative work you do, whether it's writing, music creation, whatever it may be? Do you think there's something in here that needs to be brought to the movement in terms of perhaps helping activists to process their own trauma through art?
Absolutely. I think there's definitely a need for that. There's a need to express trauma or the emotions that the activists go through. I do think it needs to be emphasized more. On a selfish level, I do think performance needs to be not just an add-on, but a thing that should be interwoven into actions, as well as music, as well as poetry, as well as thinking of things as thinking of actions. So when I talk about actions, I mean like direct action, whether that's shutting down a slaughterhouse or standing somewhere and outside a McDonald's. I think gone are the days where we can stand outside a McDonald's with the signs and say how awful this is. I don't think that's serving. I mean, it's great that people do that, but I think there's extra elements we can say. If we look at it before we even do it as a performance, we could cover so much more ground. I think if we look at things through a creative lens, we can really engage audiences on another level, reach people through captivating narratives.
There's something in here, isn't there, about that connection of the human to the non-human through art, and it's interesting to see where your work goes beyond this. What are your hopes for life post-PhD?
Well, I've got loads of hopes. The hope is to keep researching. I'm really interested in performing utopia in animal rights. So looking at how we can perform a better world through activism. I love to write a book about performing arts animal rights. I feel like I've got a lot of material now, but I'd also like to be much more creative in the activist sphere. I think that's my biggest desire. I always feel like I'm holding myself back with getting out there and just being more creative and being more performative and trying to embed it more even into local activism. So yeah, a mixture of things, or just run away and live in the woods. Again, that's another desire, just because of the impending climate crisis. Live with the squirrels.
Yeah, an increasingly viable option for running away. I might be with you on that one. All right. Well, it's been a brilliant conversation. We could go for hours on this, I'm sure. But we do want to end with another one of your works.
Yeah, fairground is an experience, a reaction to an experience I had at a slaughterhouse vigil at Manchester Pig Save. So it's a pig slaughterhouse that just do pigs and they gas them. And it's a very unique experience because you can stand right next to the wall that divides you between the gas chamber and the outside. So you can listen to the very real screams of the pigs going into the gas chamber. And the gas chamber, of what I understand, is like a carousel. I mean, you can see footage of it. They go into like little cages and they're lowered into gas and then come back out very nearly dead. So this idea of carousel and this kind of horrific spin on a fairground where they're going to something to their death. And it just explains their very real life of limited movement, limited access to natural desires, and limited access to their mother. When they do move, they move straight into a gas chamber to their death. So yeah, this is a lovely note to end on, but it very much reflects the tone of what I'm doing and the importance of what I'm trying to get across in my work.
Ben's work can be seen at performinganimalrights.tumblr.com. His podcast, Performing Animal Rights, is on Spotify and at performinganimalrights.org. And for those of you in the Northeast looking for a sanctuary, Bright Eyes Sanctuary can be found on Instagram.
Fairground. Fall into the darkness. Metal bars surround, crammed together. Heat rises, noise everywhere. Shouts and squeals. Mam's out of reach. Darkness stares. Floor hardens. It doesn't give. Time stops. Then a sudden rush. Speeding up ramps to flashes of light. Roars and air blasts face. No rest. Stop. Down the ramp quick. Stop. Crammed into a moving cage. Creaking and hissing. Screams. Nearer to darkness. To screams. Insides burn. No air. Become screams. Deeper darkness.